Welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. No Joe today, no Alex either, but you get me, Seb, and you're also going to get Stuart James, and we're going to talk about Swansea City. Swansea's story has taken a little bit of a nosedive over the last half decade. Obviously, once upon a time, they were the club of the Supporters Trust, the glorious rise, the back from the brink story. That's turned sour over the last couple of years, and it probably hasn't received some of the attention, as much attention it was probably due. And Stuart's really great. There's no finer reporter than Stuart James on Swansea City, and he's had a front row seat on the goings on over the last couple of years, and just where the club has declined and the situation that now exists between the ownership and the fans and the team. It's a mess, and Stuart does his very best at explaining it to us. Now, let's get to Stuart. Okay, so before we get to Stu, I'm just going to give a quick plug to the film Jack to a King, because I rewatched it for the first time in a few years today. It's not, it doesn't come with all the sort of the bells and whistles of a lot of the Amazon documentaries out at the moment, and doesn't have that same kind of gloss, but as a bit of storytelling, it's essential in understanding where Swansea came from, what they were, what they had to endure to even get to the Premier League, and also for understanding the context of the conversation we're about to have, because I think what's unique about Swansea is, in the first instance, the kind of the relatability of their story. Unfortunately, an awful lot of clubs know what it is to fear for their right to exist. Very few kind of reached the heights that Swansea did, and then suffered a sort of I wouldn't say decline in status, but just a very strange change in identity, I think, and that's why we're having Stu on. Thank you so much for joining us, Stu.
Real pleasure, Seb. Real pleasure. Nice to be on. Thank you.
Let's go back to where Jack to a King ends, actually, and 2011. I remember first being drawn to the Swansea story because, well, it was so seductive for very obvious reasons. And around that time, I don't think there was a club in the country that was more admired, or a chairman that was kind of more loved. What do you remember of that time?
Incredible time looking back, because they were, and quite rightly as well at the time, lauded as the model club, weren't they? Everyone saw Swansea, that blueprint, in several ways. We can talk about on the pitch, where they had a really clear playing philosophy, an attractive playing philosophy as well. It probably started with Roberto Martinez, and even when people moved on, probably with the exception of Paulo Sousa, where I think that they came close to getting into the playoffs that season, but the football, that there was certainly a shortage of goals. But that apart, there was this continuity with, even when managers came and went, that they carried on playing what became known as the Swansea way, and all the while off the field, you had this fantastic story as well, because you had essentially local businessmen who saved the club when it was very close to going out of the Football League, and when it was in a hell of a mess, who were still at the helm, who'd been there seeing this club through the divisions, playing this really nice brand of football. And you also had supporter representation on the board, which I think was another really big thing. And for that reason, everyone looked at Swansea and thought, if we're gonna try and find a way to get to the top without throwing loads and loads of money at it, we haven't got a wealthy benefactor. Then you looked at Swansea and thought, that's a really, really good plan to follow. It was an amazing story that obviously culminated in that promotion to the Premier League under Brendan Rodgers, when they won the playoff final 4-2 against Reading. And then I think a lot of people probably wrote Swansea off that summer, and certainly that season ahead, when they thought they'd struggle and go straight back down. And obviously something very different happened I think I can remember the first game was live on Sky, if I remember right, against Man City on a Monday night, I believe. And I think Swansea lost 4-0. But they played some really good stuff that night, and people were quite fascinated by the extent to which they retained the ball at that time. It was, I think, possession-based football the Premier League was certainly coming round to that by that time, but it was quite novel for a team that had won promotion to go and do what Swansea did. So they were a fascinating club in many ways, as I say, in terms of how they played, in terms of how it was run.
To be fair to Swansea on that night, I think if I remember rightly, that Man City game was actually Sergio Aguero's debut. So
It was. Did he
fair,
come on and did he score? Come on and score, Seb, or something? Or did
he
he
scored
start? I don't know.
that 30-yarder as his first goal in the Premier League, and then he got there was like a David Silva cutback which he tucked in, I think. So it was. But I remember Michel Vorm playing the game of his life that night.
Yeah.
So there is a reason why we're having this conversation now. At the beginning of October, it came out via the company's house website that Steve Kaplan, who is a majority owner of Swansea City, of the consortium that owns Swansea City even, had resigned as a director. I went on the Swansea City website today, and there's still no reference or clarity as to why this has happened. And also, there's been a communication from the Supporters Trust, who are also none the wiser. We're going to come back to this in a little bit more detail later. But what I want to do with Stu, if we can, is let's chart the journey between 2011 and the present day. And I suppose the most obvious waypoint is July 2016, when an American consortium led by Kaplan and business partner Jason Levine acquired a controlling stake of the club for around £75 million. What was it about that sale and the dynamics of it and the way it was undertaken that created the kind of the fractures that followed and deepened and widened as a result of the sale?
Yeah, I think fundamentally there's obviously been a huge issue with the Supporters Trust over time, and the trust has always maintained. Bear in mind, the trust, I think it's probably important to say. So they've got, I think it's right in saying, 21.1% stake in the club, and they have always maintained that the trust was excluded from negotiations over that ownership change. I mean, it's been a long, drawn-out case, this, and it may well end up in court. I think there's every chance it will, and an action could end up being taken against the buyers. It could end up being taken against the sellers. It's a very messy situation. So, and interestingly, I mean, I was listening back to a few things today, and one of the things I listened to was when they were first presented. Well, it was Jason Levien there, who's one of the majority sort of shareholders, along with Steve Kaplan, and the co-chairman of DC United. And he's speaking alongside Hugh Jenkins in July 2016 at the Liberty Stadium, and kind of explaining how they've come to get involved in the club. And there are some questions that day around the trust, and clearly at that point the trust had made it clear that they weren't happy with what had gone on. It's quite uncomfortable watching that footage back and seeing Hugh Jenkins and Jason Levien struggling to answer the question, really. And the question was posed was the effect of, should the trust feel let down? Have they a right to feel let down? And then April the following year, Kaplan and Levien attended a fans forum, April 2017. And it was then when they faced, some difficult questions, and rightly so, a lot of people would say, that Levien said, and I've got the quote here, and this is an hour and a half this forum went on for, and he says, he's been asked about the trust situation. He says, when we first learned of the opportunity to invest in Swansea City Football Club, we met with some of the shareholders, not including the trust, and we were told at that time that for us to proceed with the transaction quietly and for us to discuss the terms of that transaction, we should not engage with the trust. So I'm sure that was probably something that other people didn't want him to come out and say that day, but he did say that, and that was an admission, obviously, that the other shareholders, some of them, who we can't be sure, but it basically advised Kaplan and Levien to stay out of it. Now there might be a counter story to that, but that issue is never gone away, and it's rumbled around in the background for the last 4 years. At times it's got worse, perhaps coinciding with when things have got bad on the pitch, but it's never gone away, and it won't until we probably end up with some sort of court case. So the other thing around the takeover that I think made things really, really messy, Seb, is that they retained people like Hugh Jenkins, Hugh should have gone at that time. And I think if we were to get Hugh on here, I'm sure he won't admit it publicly. If you were to speak to him privately, put it that way, I'd be surprised if Hugh didn't say that. I can't say he would, but deep down, his feelings must be, I should have left Swansea City the moment we sold. And we had this bizarre situation where he sold some of his stake. I mean, he still is a director. He still has, I believe, around 5% of shares, but he doesn't have any sort of voting rights. He sold, but he was there, sat next to Jason Levian that morning, July 2016, as the chairman of the club still, and they wanted him to stay on in that role. And when you look at that press conference back, I mean, Jason can't speak highly enough of Hugh. I think Hugh has a tremendous football mind, he said. We're going to rely heavily on Hugh. He actually says we wouldn't be making this investment without Hugh's commitment to the club moving forward and without his partnership. And he later is asked in this press conference about new signings, and he says, the biggest signing we've made so far is the guy to my right. So, that's how it was in July 2016. I think I know that sat uncomfortably with a lot of supporters. It's a very difficult issue because, the bottom line is Hugh Jenkins and a number of others were there to save the club, putting money in when other people didn't, at a time when Swansea City were, really fighting to survive in every sense, on the pitch and off the pitch. And in a way, you can probably look at it and say, well, do you know what? They were perfectly within their rights to sell. The questions would surround, was that sale handled in the correct and proper manner in terms of the trust? Some people would say, should they have done more due diligence on the people they were selling to? And then I think the other issue, which I don't think really, Hugh and others have a leg to stand on, is that actually when they sold, they should have just left. And then you had this really awkward situation. You and I attended some of these games, where it really became toxic, the Liberty Stadium, and Hugh Jenkins sat in the director's box, was taking the brunt of that criticism, and it would be difficult to believe that didn't impact on the pitch at times as well. Liberty went from being such an amazing place to go to quite a poisonous place to go and watch football. So sorry, that's a long answer, but it's a hell of a mess, really, and it was from the start.
Just want to go back to a couple of things you mentioned. Firstly, like in terms of what a good place the Liberty was to watch football. So one of my favourite, I don't do so much match reporting anymore, but one of my favourite memories was covering Swansea against Burnley. And for people that haven't been or don't know, the press box at the Liberty Stadium is open, so it's just part of the concourse. Essentially, you walk up, and fans. Your desk is at the front, but fans are able to sort of walk past you, and you can mingle and chat to people and stuff. And Fernando Llorente scored a very, very late winner. It was a couple of months, I think, after Paul Clement when Paul Clement first arrived, and sort of initially sort of instilled a little bit of rigidity and a little bit of I'm not quite sure what. I mean, obviously it didn't pan out the long term, but it was a great moment because Llorente scores. It's a critical moment on the way to survival, and I'm sat there trying to meet my deadline. And I had about 4 different fans on my back celebrating whilst I'm trying to type. And my laptop was never really the same again after that day. And then fast forward to the Brighton game that you mentioned. We talked a little bit before we started recording about this. The other one is probably Newcastle at home, when Newcastle won by a single Jamal Lascelles goal to 0. And when a football stadium turns, and people think that sort of journalists and fans can be a bit melodramatic about this. I don't really agree, because I think when a football stadium turns, it can be amongst the most uncomfortable places you could possibly wish to be in. And I remember sitting there as a kind of a little bit voyeuristic, because I'm an outsider. I'm not a Swansea fan. But sort of having this club that you sort of have a little bit of an attachment to, because you see ideals in it and you see what it's become. It was really, really unpleasant. I think the thing that struck me is whenever a supporters trust is circumvented, or allegedly circumvented, the obvious question is to ask why that is. Why it was that sort of they were advised that a supporters trust wouldn't like to hear the kind of the proposal or be part of the negotiations of a new investor potentially. That's the thing that stays with me, Stu.
It was quite a thing, wasn't it, Seb, for Jason Evans to come out with that day to say that, and you can't change that. This isn't like me quoting a source or something like that, an off the record steer. Anyone can go and listen to that audio from that forum, as I as I did earlier. Yeah, none of that sat very well at all. I mean, I it's interesting what you say about Liberty. I mean, it's probably important that I say, isn't it, that I'm a season ticket holder there. I don't have a long-standing relationship with Swansea City Football Club. I mean, I think hopefully don't mind me sort of saying all this. Is my I was probably quite emotionally detached from football for a little while, where when my playing career finished, and I hadn't watched anyone else during that point. I was just playing. Then I'll go and work and cover matches, and that's what it is, work. Yeah, it's great work, being paid to watch football. And then around about my son was 4, I think, and I was thinking he was really passionate about football. And I was thinking, where am I going to take him? And hopefully this story is relevant because I took him to Swansea one afternoon. They played Everton. They drew 0-0. It wasn't a very good game. But the reason I took him to Swansea is because it was such a friendly club. It was a community club. And I thought, I'm going to take him. And I also thought he'd be safe there. He'll
Yeah.
enjoy watching the football, the way Swansea play, and he'll have a nice experience. It won't be too big for him, too daunting, but it will be, the whole thing will be pleasant. What I didn't know when I took him that afternoon was that he'd go and fall in love with it there and then, and that is exactly how it happened. And the next thing, I end up getting swept along with it, and I'm a season ticket holder. He's been a season ticket holder there for 4 years now, since he was 5, and he absolutely loves it. But to see the Liberty how it was and to see what it became, I mean, there were times during that season you talked about there with the Brighton game and the season he ended up going down where I'd take him to games and I'd think, I'm not sure I want him there.
No.
And that's an awful thing to say. And he did still keep going and he did still sit through it all. But when you've got, and I don't knock the supporters for doing it at all because they were so upset and frustrated and they certainly feel like that now, that they're not being listened to and people aren't communicating with them and telling them what's going on at their football club. And so when they're singing, you greedy bastards, get out of our club, which is what they were, and they were obviously directing that at those who had sold and who were still sat in the director's box, it was just a million miles away from what the Liberty Stadium used to be when it was hymns and arrows and all the rest, and so it was sort of sad to see that transition. But and I don't know where the trust go from here. I mean, yes, when the trust is circumvented on things, exactly as you say, you sort of, well, why would you do that? What is it you don't want them to know? And some will counterclaim and say, well, the trust had always maintained that they'd never want to sell, but I don't know. It doesn't. None of that sits very well at all. And it's just a sorry situation really. And as I say, to see what the club was and what it now is, it's such a fractured club now. And whereas Swansea's success, as I see it, was built on being this club where it was greater than the sum of its parts, really.
I mean, I suppose also like it was the kind of the model of what a supporters trust could achieve. Um, I remember a couple of years ago doing some reporting down there, and there were an awful lot of negative things said specifically about the trust function and how it had kind of been diluted and how it deteriorated. Um, are you able to characterize what the kind of the dynamic between the fans and the supporters trust is at the moment?
So I became a member of the trust last year. I don't know why I didn't sign up before. It wasn't a conscious decision not to, but it disappoints me when I look at the number of people who are members of the trust, Seb, because I don't know what people would think, what Swansea's average gate is. I don't know, average gate in times when people can go to the stadium.
Yeah, sure,
I
sure,
don't know what
sure.
it was last season, 16, 17,000, something like that. It must have been, I don't know, around that mark. And in my mind, I'd have thought there'd be like 10,000 trust members. I don't know, the same number of trust members as almost season ticket holders. I haven't got the exact figure in front of me now, but I know when I was told it, I was really, really alarmed. I've got in my head that it's somewhere around a couple of thousand, something like that. And I just thought, crikey, the trust has been around for a long time. I don't know how many members it's lost over time, or whether it's not had, people haven't gone for. You'll hear an awful. You look on social media, and there will be people. The trust will try and push for people to join, and I want people to, because I think the more people that are involved in the trust, even if you're not particularly happy with what the decisions it's made over time, then the more powerful we can be as a supporter group, because you need that kind of unity. But you'll get an awful lot of people, to answer your question, moaning about the trust, saying the trust haven't done enough, saying the trust, should have done more at the time of the takeover, saying the trust should have done more the other day with the announcement you mentioned. But it's difficult for them because, yes, the trust would have known at the board meeting 2 weeks before that Steve Kaplan's status was going to change and that he would be standing down as director, but that doesn't mean that they're in a position to publicly announce things like that. So some people just don't understand that, and then that then colours their perception of the trust, and they think the trust are holding things back from people. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. I'm sure some things could have been done better over time, but that's like everything. Ultimately, at the minute, I think, if you're asking me what I think supporters should be doing, then I think they should be signing up to be part of the supporters trust and trying to, if you're not happy about something, then it's there's the whole thing, isn't it? With like the election or whatever, then you should always vote no matter what. And I feel like that's the case with the trust now. Be part of it, and if you don't like something the way it's being done, then say something, but don't just sit there on social media and tweet something negative about the trust. But yeah, it isn't. I can't paint a picture there, Seb, where it's all rosy, because it's not. And that's another issue, obviously, that not only have you got this dislike for the owners. It's not as if you've got the fans galvanising together in perhaps the same way that they would have been years ago when they were driving Petty out of the club. So yeah, it's another problematic situation, really.
We've talked about, we're going to get to Kaplan,
Mm.
because obviously that's the kind of crux of the issue here. But I think it's important to to describe just how nebulous the ownership structure actually was, because when it was first presented to me, please correct me if I've got this wrong, but when it was first presented to me, it was a new American investors, in the kind of the typical form. So two people investing £75 million in exchange for shareholding, and as a result, control of the club. In reality, from conversations with fans, of course, there's a lot of people that still don't really understand actually the makeup of this ownership group and what these people sit on top of. I've had it explained to me a couple of times and still don't really understand. But is it sort of a lot of kind of unseen people? I mean, how many different people are actually involved in the ownership group, or who were involved in the original purchase?
Yeah, that's probably the easiest way. I mean, it's a very good question. In short, Seb, there's a total lack of transparency here. And going back to that original press conference I mentioned, July 2016, one of the early questions is about, percentages. And Hugh Jenkins says at that point, in quotes, the percentages will be confirmed at a later date. Well, they never were.
No.
And it's as simple as that, really. It wasn't until BBC Wales, actually, about 18 months later, ran a story where they revealed that it wasn't just Kaplan and Levin, and that there was another 25 other investors involved here, all with a lot of them with quite small stakes. I mean, Landon Donovan was one of them. It was a real, sort of on the face of it, diverse group of people. Now, at the forum, prior to that, what I mentioned to you, the forum in April 2017, it had been asked from the floor there about the makeup of the rest of this consortium, and Kaplan, I'm 99% sure it was him, not Levin, said that. That essentially they were friends of theirs and no one had anything to worry about. He says, like, there isn't another government involved or another country involved in this in any way. But again, nothing has ever been sort of said definitively on that other than what the BBC revealed. And when I spoke to someone, prior to coming on here earlier in the week about this, they said, well, you won't get that information, Stu. It's just not out there. And, I believe the trust have asked for it, but they've never been given that. So, what is, it comes back to your earlier point about, circumventing the trust. What is there to hide here?
Exactly that.
It just doesn't sit well, any of that. So what we do know effectively is that obviously they purchased at 68% of the club. I think the club was valued at about 100 million around then, so roughly, 68 million pounds, and that Kaplan and Levin are the largest shareholders in that group, and I think I'm right in saying with almost 30% of the consortium's shareholding between them, if that makes sense, Seb. So, yeah, that's another thing that you just, we're football fans. We want to know who's putting money into our football club, who's bought the football club, who owns the football club, who's making the decisions at the football club, and they seem like quite basic things to want to know. But for whatever reason, that information hasn't been made available, and it's not possible to, access that information because of where the accounts are filed. So it's a strange one, Seb, again.
I think also, like, and this is a question which is becoming far more common, and which many supporters across the well, up and down the country, and I guess up and across Europe, are asking of their ownership is, why do you own my football club?
Yeah.
And I'm guessing, see, I mean, I'm a cynic. I'm getting older. What can I say? But I would say whenever I mean, this would be one of the first three questions probably that any supporters trust would ask. Yes, how are you underwriting the security of my club? And that's particularly relevant at a place like Swansea because of what's happened in the recent past. But also, why? What is the motivation here? Because I think I don't think I know the age of the kind of the vanity purchase and the plaything. It's over because football isn't that anymore. The secret's out. All these signposts exist as to what you can get out of football as a businessman. And as far as I know, certainly when I was last down in Swansea, no, there wasn't a single fan who could answer that question, who'd ever felt that there had been a true objective communicated to them, which is, I think, the worst thing of the lot, because it's fine for someone to come in and say, I want the best for this club, but I don't necessarily have the resources to give you that sort of, that magical journey over the rainbow, because there are very few people in the world that can do that in modern football now. It's another thing to fail to give people something to buy into, fail to present a kind of a communal objective. Um, and at Swansea, given that probably uh, less than a decade ago, Swansea probably had the clearest mission statement of any club in the pyramid, not just in the Premier League. I'd say of any club in the '92 at that point. Now they're at the other end of that spectrum, which is an amazing thing to be able to say. Is that still the case, that there's no sort of, there's a vague, obviously, a vague interest in getting promoted? That's not really the same as having an objective or standing for something. But is there any clarity over this?
No, absolutely nothing. And when you say, is it still the same, I think it's got worse in my mind.
How so?
Because, well, I wrestle with this in my mind. I think, why did you get involved in the first place? Because we can't, the answers they've given, whether at that forum or whether at their day they were unveiled, and we can't, if I keep quoting those, it's because they've hardly spoken apart from that. Do you know what I mean,
Yeah.
Seb? It's not like I can draw on lots of things to sort of, explain why they've done certain things, because they've done very few interviews over time. And, that they were inevitably going to get asked that day, why Swansea City? And the answer then was sort of, full of jargon, really. I didn't listen to it and sort of think, okay, I believe you here. I look at it and I can't, in my mind, I'm thinking, you must have just done this to think, we'll have the club for a few years, we'll wait for a couple more TV deals to come along, and we'll move it on. There wasn't, they mentioned potential. I don't see how there was, even you and I describing that lovely story, I, I don't see untapped potential there. There was talk of it increasing the Liberty. Well, yeah, it used to be sold out, but I don't think there were 10,000 people on a waiting list like there was at White Hart Lane and that kind of thing. I just don't see what more they could have done with Swansea City other than potentially sell it on. And it's funny, like, we started at the top talking about Jack Till King, and I used to really enjoy watching that. And now I wouldn't put it on, and a lot of Swansea fans won't put it on because they now believe that was a marketing tool to sell the club. I don't know if it was or not, but
Really?
Yes, absolutely that, yeah.
I had no idea. Okay.
Yeah, that's how it's kind of viewed now by a lot of supporters. We can't say that was definitely the case. Who can? But it doesn't sit well with a lot of people now. And I remember really enjoying watching that film. And obviously the story is the story. You can't shy away from that. You can't try and rewrite history. It's an amazing story, but was that produced with no ulterior motive? Who knows? And were Kaplan and Levien and others reeled in by that story, and not just hearing the story, but watching that film? I don't know. People would never admit it if they were, but I don't know why they got involved. And I feel like two things here. Were those people who had the shares duty bound to do due diligence on Kaplan, Levien, when they came in? Well, maybe there is kind of a point if the club's in your blood, as it is with those people. They were part of Swansea City, crikey. a hell of a lot longer than I've been following the club, and I don't doubt for 1 minute that Hugh Jenkins loves Swansea City. But if they had sort of looked more into them, I don't know. I'd be interested in what kind of answers they would have had. But more the other way, I can't believe that Kaplan and Levien did their due diligence on Swansea, because it was unravelling, Seb, before they got involved. Things were going wrong at Swansea City long before that takeover in July 2016. The season had finished with them staying up. Really, they finished 12th. That final league position, how can I say? It feels like a
false position.
It was a false position.
Yeah,
That league table, if you looked at it now, it doesn't tell the story of that season. The last 11 games, they picked up 20 points. They suddenly had this run of form that took them to a different place in the table and made it seem like everything was fine. A lot of people would have known it wasn't. A lot of people would have known, and I know you've touched on this in articles, the recruitment had been going wrong for a while. And Hugh was heavily involved in that. He oversaw all of that, And so if Kaplan and Levien had looked at it closely, and I believe people did say things to them about this, they would have known that they needed to make changes at that football club, that they couldn't just say, carry on in charge, Hugh. All the people in those roles, carry on as you were, the scouting setup, we'll keep doing it, and we'll bring in some people who will look at some analytics and all the rest. It needed major change in my eyes. And so that was staring them in the face. And I think if they'd have looked at that in far greater depth, they would have realised that when they came in, they needed to make changes, and they didn't. But the weird thing in all of this is, I actually think, despite everything we've said so far, I think Swansea could have got away with it. And I think they could have and would have had Brendan Rodgers been appointed in that summer, in July 2016. Brendan Rodgers thought he was coming back to Swansea. Talks had gone on during that period when Francesco Guidolin had the contract until the end of the season. Rodgers was out of work, having left Liverpool. Brendan thought he was coming back. He'd even, looked at properties down in Swansea. He was ready to come back, and then all of a sudden, the phone calls stopped coming. And that coincided with that little purple patch that Guidolin had. And we should say as well, Alan Curtis was in charge for some of that because Guidolin was ill in hospital with a chest problem. But that purple patch seemed to skew Hugh Jenkins' thoughts. And for whatever reason, he decided, and I remember when this was announced, this appointment, and I thought, I cannot believe that. And I know it surprised people at the club. Guidolin got a 2-year contract, and Rodgers obviously didn't get the job. And that was a sliding doors moment for Swansea City, because I believe, even everything we've said about the ownership structure, that with Brendan Rodgers there, Swansea would have been okay, because I don't think Brendan would have stood for a lot of the signings that happened, and you'd have had a far better team on the pitch. So that really is, for me, a real kind of crossroads for the club. And yeah, then obviously Guidolin was out of a job by the October, and then that set in train Bob Bradley, and really, from then on in, Swansea were just another Premier League club, just trying to play survival football, trying to get 40 points, trying to stay up. And they kept circling the plug hole, and if you do that long enough, that's what happened in 2018 when they went down.
I think what struck me, and this is a kind of cultural change, is whenever you used to observe things happening at Swansea, you'd kind of, whatever it may have been, whether it was a kind of managerial decision or a recruiting decision or a sale, you used to kind of nod along and think, yeah, that makes sense. Like, okay, it may not be ideally what the club wants, but given their position in the food chain and, given what their long-term objectives are, I kind of understand, for instance, the reason to renegotiate Wilfred Boney's contract and then sell him, because they removed, that release clause, didn't they? And it was kind of, everything like that seemed typical. But when you look back now, and we look at Guidolin's the classic example. I mean, I remember sitting next to Ian McIntosh at the Liberty once, and him saying, probably in about September of that season, I've only just learned to spell his name, and now he's going to be sacked. Because that's how inevitable it seemed. That's how short term everything had become.
Yes.
And then when you look back at, if you take a second glance at some of the recruiting decisions and the way in which money was spent, I think you'd say, if you were being fair, it worked out well. But some of the decisions weren't probably going through the right processes. So what I mean by that is that the right people weren't making those decisions. For instance, do a club in Swansea's position do you spend that kind of money and commit that kind of salary to someone like John Joe Shelby? Maybe, but there's a personality, not problem there, but a personality potentially to overcome. Um, and it's little things that, if you look back retrospectively, you kind of add up and think your point about potential is really what I'm getting at, because I think it needed stabilizing rather than someone just to kind of scattergun transfer decisions and who can we dig out of a black book of managerial options. And one of the moments I think about quite a lot is Byram Tatumlu's rant on Twitter. He's Michael Laudrup's agent.
Yeah.
And him making all kinds of possibly libelous remarks about Hugh Jenkins. But just thinking that was quite a strange thing to happen at a club like Swansea, or my perception of what a club like Swansea was. It just seems, I don't know, it's very easy to now second guess it and think what was actually happening there and what were the decisions and just how strong was the club's momentum at that point in time. It's a bit of a rabbit hole. I'm gonna fast forward this, and I'm gonna throw a name at you, just because there are some very strange quotes attached to it. Jake Silverstein. I think August of this year, he became an investor. He was given a spot on the club's board. Now, again, please correct me if I'm wrong here, Stu, but as far as I understand it, his investment is actually in the form of a loan to the club.
Yeah, convertible loan, as I understand it, Seb.
Yeah, and that can be converted to shares at a later point. And here's a sentence that will make everyone think of the social network scene. And if that happens, other shareholders will either be given the chance for further investment or their holding will be diluted. I'm not a financially minded person. That sounds very weird.
No, not me. I hope you're not going to ask me to explain all that.
No, just nod along with me and just affirm how weird it all is.
I'm nodding.
Yeah. What is that about? I know that's
I don't know.
That's not a highbrow question, but I can't get my head around that. That seems very
No,
strange.
I don't think any of us can. It's just surreal. I mean, that kind of came from right out of the blue, that, and now there are all sorts of theories. I don't know whether they call them conspiracy theories or what. Especially now it's emerged that obviously Kaplan is no longer a director. And some people think, was this investment, if we can call it that in sort of quotes, was this investment sort of the start of something? Is this paving the way now for, especially with what we know with Kaplan standing down as director, to sort of, I don't know, take a back seat and eventually Jake Silverstein to come out and to take over? That some people think that's a possibility. These are only theories, and the reason no one can say anything with any certainty is because of the total lack of communication over everything, and that makes it so difficult to understand what's going on at the football club. I mean, there were some quotes attributed to Silverstein when he when this was announced. It appeared on the Swansea website, and he talked about how much he enjoyed watching the Swans play, which I don't know, maybe he does enjoy watching.
I've actually got that quote in front of me, Stu.
Go on, read it out to me.
I'll read it, and people can draw their own conclusions. Quote, I love watching the Swans play. The team has developed such a distinctive and engaging style on the pitch, and I have a deep appreciation for its fan culture and the club's commitment to its supporters. Which, if I was a Swansea fan, I'm not sure I'd have been able to get to the end of that sentence.
Was he watching, like me, when the Swans won 1-0 at Deepdale? I just at the start of the season and thinking, I love how the Swans play. I just don't. Maybe I'm doing the man a disservice, but it's you reading all that out. It's hard to sort of picture
deep
it,
appreciation for the fan culture and the club's commitment to its supporters. I mean,
yeah.
I'm not one of them, but I know that's not quite how they characterise it.
No. So the whole idea, he likes watching the Swans play. The whole idea that he gets the fans' relationship with the club and all that. Then, it just feels really superficial and disingenuous, and all the rest. It's sadly the state of play. As far as I'm aware, he's had no conversations with the trust whatsoever. I think the trust said that in their statement they released this week, this week. So they don't really know anything about his his involvement, why he's doing it, what his ultimate interests are here, his objective, coming back to your question earlier on, and why Swansea, why are they doing what they're doing? We don't know any of that really. Yeah, it's just it's had another layer of sort of
It's almost subterfuge.
yeah, it
I
is.
mean,
It is. It just, you know, this idea, like someone investing as if it's sort of, you thought, is this the sort of, the guy who's coming in to sort of save you, and then you, would it be in Swansea City? You never think that anyway, but then you read, yeah, actually it's not really investments, a loan, and it's a convertible loan, and you just, yeah, I don't know where any of this is going to. People tell me that Kaplan is still very much the man calling the shots here, but to go back to something you mentioned earlier, I just find it staggering that could emerge on Company's House on Monday, and clearly BBC Sport Wales, who ran a story, put it to Swansea, and Swansea said they wouldn't be commenting. And I want to make it clear when I say this now that obviously is zero criticism of anyone and working day to day at the club or the media department or anyone else for not commenting. They're effectively saying what they've been told to say. But how staggering that can come out, a really significant move. Bear in mind, we understand that Kaplan is the main man and the majority shareholder, and he's stepping down from the board, or his position as a director, and yet the club Kaplan and Levin feel there's no need to explain that and what's going on to supporters. I find that staggering.
I went on the website. We're recording this on a Monday evening, on a Sunday evening, sorry, and it's coming out on Tuesday. But as of this moment, there isn't even a cursory line on the website.
No.
Not even explaining it, but just sort of noting that it has occurred, that this change has happened, and this is a very significant
Don't
change.
you find that remarkable, Seb? I mean, I just find that bizarre. Absolutely bizarre.
It's the kind of thing that makes me want to ask more questions. I think that a football club that is behaving in a healthy way, all football clubs are a little bit reserved. They operate a little bit in the dark because that's the kind of the native culture. But you communicate small changes whether people are interested in them or not. When people get interested, it's generally because there's a vacuum, there's an information void. And this is just another one. I mean, I think it's telling that within their statement, the Supporters Trust, and this is kind of their key line, I think, it is important to our fans that they know, A, who is responsible for making decisions in our football club, and B, what are the intentions of those who own our club. Now, when Supporters Trust ask questions like that, it's really negative. And one of the reasons I want to have you on, man, is because we've covered, we've done a bit of work on Wigan and Hull with Adam Crafton, wonderful journalist. Did brilliant reporting on both those cases, and they're very, very egregious situations. They're dreadful. They're the kind of the worst nightmare. Whereas I think I characterize Swansea as as a sort of the, not crisis, but the situation that's kind of been ignored in the mainstream. It's just not quite obviously bad enough. I know that's not the most elegant sentence anyone's ever going to speak on a podcast, but I think that's fair. I think that's a fair analysis.
It is fair, Seb, but also, and this came up when I was having a conversation with someone at club in the week, and I think the reason this is the case also is because actually it's not been that bad on the pitch.
No.
And actually, the owners, have got away with it because of that. Because Potter worked a minor miracle in that first season where, this is the other thing, when I look at, this is how badly recruitment had gone wrong. When you look in that last season in the Premier League when they ridiculously, and I love Wilfred Burnley to bits, but he should never have been re-signed. Andre Ayew, as well as he did last season in the Championship, should never have been re-signed either. It was a mad deal. Sam Klukas, 15 million. It was crazy. I'm not going to come on here now and say he shouldn't have signed Renato Sanchez, because when he signed, I thought this was blooming amazing. Renato Sanchez is coming to Swansea. Obviously, it didn't work out that way, and no one knew, how kind of broken he was, for want of a better way of putting it. But I'm not going to try and, rewrite history around that, because when he signed, I thought it was good. But some of those other deals were awful. And when Swansea went down, I look at, say, Bournemouth now, who've been in the Premier League not at dissimilar time, 5 years to Swansea 7. At least they had some assets. They had Nathan Ake they could get 40 million for. They had Ramsdale they could get 18 million for. They've still got David Brooks there. They'd be able to sell Josh King. Callum Wilson, 20 million went. So those kind of deals they were able to do, Seb, whereas Swansea, short of Alfie Mawson, and Fabianski went for a minimal sum because he had a year left. They were really scrambling around after 7 years in the Premier League and after spending decent money in their final season in the Premier League to sell people. They couldn't get people to take Andre Ayew and Wilfred Burnley off their hands. And so that's a measure of how badly things had gone wrong leading them into the Championship. And I say that in the context of what a good job Graham Potter did the following season when, I remember being on holiday on deadline day. I took a screenshot of it, and I remember going back to my hotel room, and I had like 5 players on the sort of. I'm sad enough to have the Swansea City updates of who'd gone. I'm trying to think. Federico Fernandez, Jordan. There was a load of them who went that.
Jordi and Matt, did he go that day?
Yeah, Jordi and Matt. Jordan Ayew, I think, went to Palace on loan.
Montero, maybe.
Yeah, there was a list of them. And so Potter was just left with this chaos where he then ended up playing, Joe Rodon, which obviously has turned into a brilliant success story, and Joe Rightly getting his chance.
Yeah, but fabulous player, Joe Rodon.
Yeah. Exactly. And DJ, Daniel James, who wasn't in the team at the start of that season, came into his own. Ollie took on the mantle of being the number 9, and it worked out. But Graham Potter also got Swansea playing terrific football. I think we finished 11th, but it didn't really bother me that, because I just really enjoyed, after years of survival football, seeing Swansea playing what I thought of as the Swansea way. So because of that, and they had the cup run, they played brilliantly against Man City, the ownership thing, Seb, kind of got forgotten about a little bit. It was in the minds of supporters, but even in supporters' minds, it was probably pushed at times a little bit to the back. It certainly wasn't toxic liberty in the way it used to be in that Premier League final season. And then last season, obviously, with Steve Cooper, Swansea end up getting in the playoffs. So, those examples you mentioned with some of the other clubs, Hull end up getting relegated, Wigan do too, albeit, through the point deduction. But Swansea weren't knocking around in the lower reaches of the league, where it probably would have shone a more unfavourable light on things off the field. And even now, as we're talking, I know it's early days, but they got 10 points from 4 games, and they've only conceded 1 goal, and it's going along, I'm touching wood here, quite nicely. But it's not going along, and it hasn't done for the last few years well, because of anything the owners have done. Steve Cooper and Graham Potter have been, in my mind, working with one hand, maybe 2 behind their back the whole time. And I look at some of the investment elsewhere. So yeah, there are interesting examples you make, and I do see parallels. But the question that I think a lot of fans would probably feel and worry is, sooner or later this is going to come to an end. The work in the sort of oracle on the field, and players will go on. They won't be replaced, and then. And the academy will run dry. The academy that we know is now going to become Cat 2 instead of Cat 1, because there's another cost saving going on there. And sooner or later, Seb, things are going to unravel on the pitch unless something dramatically changes. And I can't see off the field anything dramatically changing.
It almost feels to me, the last game I covered was the 2-2 with Leeds United a couple of years ago.
What a game that was, by the way, wasn't it?
Brilliant game of football. And it's the perfect emblem for what you've just said, because if you were an outsider and you knew nothing about the previous few years, maybe you watch that game and you come away from the Liberty and you think, all's fine here. Okay, they've had a little bit of a downturn, but this is a talented squad. You also, there's a magnetic figure like McBurney at the club, scruffiest bastard in the Football League, but a brilliant footballer, and just one of those guys that if you're a fan, you love someone like that. I know he's moved on and he's got his chance, and hopefully he'll show what a good player he is at Sheffield United. But when you have players like that, they go a long way to distracting from bigger issues, because they're the thing in front of your face. They're the kind of the players that you want at your football club. And it was a talented side, and you're quite right. Potter was doing a wonderful job there, and Steve Cooper is a really excellent coach, I think, in my mind. And it's like a team achieving in spite of itself, because ridiculously, you could make the argument, I think, that if Swansea get through that Brentford semi-final, maybe they beat Fulham, because goodness knows what happened to Brentford at Wembley. But that's and then they're back in the Premier League, and all of a sudden you have this kind of this superficial sign of success, which completely betrays what has gone on for the last couple of years. It's is this the long term trend? Is there any reason to think that is there any kernel of optimism here?
No, in my mind. I mean, the only thing I'll say is it doesn't feel like a fantastic championship this season. It sounds very cliched, this, but it doesn't feel like there is a Leeds or a West Brom. There's certainly not a Wolves of years ago, or I don't know, a powerful club like a Villa that's underachieving that could get its act together. I don't see that, and Swansea, the biggest problem will be the lack of depth because Cooper has a small squad. Again, when I see what some of the other clubs have done, the number of signings someone like Forest have made, or Bristol City, what they've done over time, and I think what Potter and Cooper have worked with the last 2 years. So, if there's any optimism, it's that could they get into the playoffs again this season? Yes. And then, then there could be a chance of going up, which, as you right said, that would have been bonkers if Swansea had gone up last season. Yeah. Absolutely bonkers. But they weren't that far off doing it. Now, what happens after this year? This is the final season of the parachute payments. So there's going to be another kind of resetting of the button there. You'd be really concerned. I also look at it and think, how long before Steve Cooper gets a better offer somewhere? How long before Steve Cooper gets fed up with it? We've heard, he's been for Steve Cooper, he's been quite outspoken, since early this season, where he made the comments about Peterson leaving in the wake of the recent the most recent match, where he basically said that I was told on the day of the game by the chief executive, Julian Winter, that to leave him out of the squad, and he's been making other noises around we can't afford to lose anyone. So he probably thinks also he's speaking from a position of power now, because he's obviously done a good job. He's also saying things that are totally fair. I don't even know what's the club worth now. So let's say they've parted with best part of 70 million for a club at the time that was valued at 100. I can't believe they get half their money back now in the Championship. But then how do they get themselves out of Swansea City Football Club? The only way, to me, really, which they must want to do, let's be honest, they must want to wash their hands of this and forget it ever happened. They've got to get the club back in the Premier League, really. That's the only way they're going to be able, as I see it, to shift the football club. So to do that, they're going to have to give the managers, some opportunity to achieve that. Unless the worrying thing is they look at it the last 2 years and think, well, actually, we haven't been a million miles away. It's quite possible we can keep doing it like this and we'll get lucky. But they won't. I don't think they will. And it's hard to look at this with any sense of optimism, and because of those things you've talked about, with Jake Silverstein getting involved and with Kaplan doing what he's doing, and the other thing we should probably mention, Seb, is that actually, when Trevor Birch was there, we did have someone at the club who was communicating with the supporters. Trevor would do, quite long statements, and often there'd be quite a bit of bad news in those statements. But I know Trevor used to be quite amazed at how well they were received, because I'd say to him, that's because you're telling people what's going on,
isn't he? He's been in football for a long time, and I think maybe that's the difference, Stu, really.
And he was communicating, Seb. That was a big thing. Even if he was telling you stuff that wasn't great about your club and the state of its finances, he was telling you. You weren't waiting for what we had before, which was sort of Hugh Jenkins' programme notes. You were getting quite a good overview of what was going on, and you've gone from the programme notes to Trevor to now you've gone to nothing again. Not only do you not know really what's going on in terms of day-to-day running, you don't even know why your majority shareholder is no longer a director. And Julian Winter, who's been brought in as chief executive, I don't know Julian Winter, but what we do know, and Julian's come out and said this himself, is that he's known the owners for 5 or 6 years before they got involved at Swansea. So maybe unfairly that didn't make me feel good about the situation. I just couldn't help thinking, well, he's going to be doing everything in the owner's interests. And whereas I felt when Trevor Birch was there, he was basically, he was working for Cooper and for the fans as much as he was working for them. And I don't see that being the case going forward with the structure that's in place now. So yeah, who knows, who knows where it's all leading? But the bottom line is on the pitch at the minute is pretty good.
It's just such a sad situation, and not least because there are some really good people at Swansea.
Mm.
Phil on the media door is probably the nicest person in
Oh
the
my
whole of the
God.
league. Um,
Yeah.
and people who've worked media around the Premier League and the Football League will tell you that you know sometimes that they aren't the nicest people that you run into, but everyone at Swansea I've ever met has been an absolute delight. I also want to mention Stephen Carroll because he sells his fanzine Swansea
Yeah.
outside the club
Top
shop.
lad.
Yeah, he
Brilliant
is,
lad.
and he was also he was very generous with his time with me and explaining things that actually were very very difficult to explain. It's a couple of years ago now, but he was always there for to give some guidance, and obviously difficult to watch your club twist itself into a big knot, really.
I'm really glad you mentioned those people, Seb. Sorry, I'm it's and I should have done really. There. So that's another reason why why I end up going to Swansea with my
It's the
lad
people, Stu. Of course it
because
is.
it's the people 100%. It's because I could take him to a massive Premier League club and he wouldn't have he would have just been lost among them. He will he knows Phil and feels brilliant with him. He's just got
He's a top
su-
man.
such a warm personality and then like George on the car park, people like this who are just they sometimes I worry there's a queue of cars behind us waiting to get into that bloody car park to get to the game, and George is chatting away asking Zach about various things in there, and then we Jonathan Wiltshire, who sadly is not working for the club anymore but head of media. I mean, Jonathan's probably as responsible as anyone for me spending more money at Swansea City than the owners ever have, because he he's such a brilliant man, and when he left you saw people from all over the country, not just people who are based down in Wales who are journalists, but all over all over England as well, saying what an amazing press officer he was. And that is, it is the people. You've hit the nail on the head. That is what Swansea City Football Club is all about. And I know I think about Stevie Carroll's an absolutely brilliant lad, and that is your real. I'm no lifelong Swansea supporter. Steve could tell you chapter and verse about the club, and he cares about it so deeply, and he's not expecting his football club to be Man United or Liverpool or Chelsea or Arsenal. He just wants his football club to be run in the right way by good people who are open and honest about their intentions and treat the supporters with respect. And it's hard to believe that's the case at this present moment.
It is a little bit of a cliche to talk about family clubs, and it gets a little bit overused as a term, but it's fitting. I mean, just to finish up, I'll tell a little story. But last time I was at Swansea, there's a little cut through. The Liberty is built on, for those who haven't been, it's built on it's almost like a traffic island. That's how it looks. It's despite its roots, the area's roots even. But there's a little bit of a cut through, so you come off the roundabout, and there's a little gap in the hedge where you can hop the barrier, and then walk in without having to go around Frankie and
Mhm.
Benny's and stuff like that. I
Yeah.
remember being about 60 yards away from the stadium before um, Phil, in his very thick South Welsh accent, was greeting me and saying hello and welcoming me to the ground. And it shouldn't need saying, but that is not typical of an experience. Around football clubs, a lot of very good people around at a lot of very different, lot of different parts of the country. The bad people are very few and far between, but you would struggle to name a better club in terms of just how nice everyone is and how welcoming they are than Swansea City, and that's why this conversation is worth having. And Stu, thank you for coming on. It's a really difficult conversation for you because there's so little information, um, but it's an important one, and so thank you very very much for taking the time at the end of a weekend.
No, well, thank you very much for discussing all things Swansea City, and lovely to speak to you, Sam.